Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We are continuing the series of videos, Great Ideas in Psychology. This is part 19, based on chapter 19 of Professor Fatali Moqaddam's book with the same title. Chapter 19 is titled Evolutionary Psychology, and this is where we are. One more part to go after this. So we will talk very briefly. Evolutionary psychology is obviously a vast area of research and study. We want to just provide a starting point and in very brief introduction. Let's begin with the idea of evolution. What is evolution? And then we will turn to its application in psychology. What is evolution? The first thing we need to shake off is the association between evolution and any positive connotation, like evolution meaning progress or advancement or things getting better. That is not the technical meaning of evolution in the context of biology and psychology. Evolution doesn't mean things getting better over time. It doesn't mean progress. It doesn't mean advancement. Evolution in biology refers to a process of change that is driven by two mechanisms, at least two mechanisms, arguably three. One is random variation. So random variation is something that happens in the process of reproduction. When one member of a species reproduces, the genes are copied and those copies are imperfect. Because the genes are copied imperfectly, there are variations. Some of those variations are more consequential than others. Some are so consequential that they are considered as mutations, so-called mutations. Some of those mutations are advantageous for the survival of that offspring. Some are not. So in addition to random variations, there's a second mechanism, which is referred to as natural selection. Natural selection is about the fit between the organism and that particular environment where the organism finds itself. Sometimes those random variations, as I said, help the organism survive. Sometimes they don't. They hinder the survival of the organism. So random variations, natural selection, that's it. That is the process of evolution. Sometimes we have something other than natural selection. So instead of natural selection, we sometimes have artificial selection. That refers to the intervention of another species, usually humans. Humans sometimes intervene in the process of survival of another species, most notably in the case of domesticated animals. For example, humans have a preference for cows that produce more milk, or let's say dogs that bond better with their human companions, or chickens that don't hurt other chickens, or chickens that lay better eggs, and so on and so forth. So because of the preferences of humans who domesticated animals, the animals go through selective breeding, and because of that, they acquire different features, or some of their features become accentuated. So that's artificial selection. And artificial selection is something that Charles Darwin discussed in his classic work on the origin of species. So now that we have a very basic understanding of evolution, let's now talk about the application of evolutionary thinking in psychology. So when we bring evolutionary thinking, the evolutionary lens within psychology, we emphasize some things and de-emphasize other things. One of the things that is emphasized is continuity of behavior capacities and psychological capacities. For example, when we think about a capacity for friendship or the phenomenon of friendship, we don't just focus on friendship among human beings. We might focus on friendship among chimpanzees. So that's the continuity. We want to trace the continuity of a phenomenon, a capacity, a psychological capacity, a psychological tendency, and its persistence across generations of a species, and maybe across different species that have a common ancestor. So continuity, another way of describing that is We want to seek explanations of behavior, psychological phenomena in terms of history of selection, the history of how those psychological phenomena, psychological capacities, or behavioral tendencies, behavioral capacities, at some point, at least in the history of the species, gave the animal, gave the organism, either the individual organism or the group, some kind of survival advantage. Not all the time, not necessarily, but at least in some cases, that behavior or that psychological capacity was advantageous in the survival of the animal. That is the explanation of the behavior in terms of the history of natural selection. Okay, some examples might be helpful. So let's say, for example, we want to explain the phenomenon of male aggression, why male members of a species might be more aggressive than others. So evolutionary psychologists will say, yeah, easy, I can explain this, no problem. This is a passage from our book. So we read that the evolutionary function of male aggression, according to an evolutionary argument, is to beat out competitor males for access to females. So here is, you can think about it as a potential survival advantage. An extreme, we continue to read, an extreme form of this is what took place, for example, in ethnic cleansing wars in Bosnia in the 1990s. Males killed other males belonging to ethnic outgroups and systematically raped the women they captured. Okay, here we have an explanation of male aggression, for example, and some people might be satisfied with that. Some people might take it too far and in a nihilistic way or in a cynical way and say, yeah, this is human nature. Of course, that's not very smart. That's a mishandling of evolutionary thinking. But anyways, this sounds like a satisfying explanation, linking it to a kind of history, of selective advantage and survival and reproduction. Another example, moving on from male aggression, another example is extensively discussed, is parental investment. Parental investment is the idea that parents invest in the raising of their offspring. More specifically, males and females of a species, or male and female human beings, seem to invest differently. Females tend to want to invest more in raising kids compared to males. And in fact, the investment of males and females vary depending on the conditions. And that's a different topic. Let's just focus on parental investment and how it is explained, the style of explaining parental investment. So we read, because of the limitations of female reproduction, so because of the 9-month pregnancy period, the number of children females can have is severely limited, female humans. Okay, so there's a 9-month pregnancy period. That is one major limitation. There's also the number of years a female human being has available to her, number of years in which she can give birth to a child. So childbearing years, it's roughly a period of about 25 years. In contrast, so there's a limitation, severe limitation on the number of children, offsprings, a female human can have. In contrast, males can have an almost infinite number of children, the actual number being limited mainly by the number of female partners available to them. Okay, so this explains, for some people, this explains why men are less invested in the lives of their children compared to women, because for them, it's a smaller investment. So they are less interested in hanging around and taking care of all of these babies that they can have. This gender difference also, in addition, in the number of children that men and women can have, implies differences in the behaviors adopted by males and females for passing on genes. So things like, for example, sensitivity to fidelity. If a sexual partner has other sexual partners, men and women might be differently sensitive to that infidelity behavior. So we read, males will be more concerned about the sexual fidelity of their partners. They will show higher levels of jealousy and be more upset if they see signs of sexual infidelity in their partner. From this perspective, it makes sense that female virginity should be highly valued by males. Okay. So again, somebody might read this and take it at face value and translate the features of evolutionary history and take it kind of like translate it and draw a kind of morality out of it. Again, that's a very stupid thing to do. I've unfortunately seen, we have all seen evolutionary psychologists translate natural tendencies or evolutionary histories into a kind of morality or an escape from morality. That's unfortunate. But I just want to show you a style of reasoning, based on phenomenon and how that phenomena is related to the history of species over time, over generations of survival and into reproduction. All right. In the case of human babies, we have again an explanation about why we have a tendency, we see the dominance of two-parent investment. This style of two-parent investment is dominant because human children are very demanding. Raising human children requires extensive education, extensive investment. It requires lots of resources, and it is very difficult for one parent alone to make a living and take care of the children. So an effective, more sensible way of raising kids is two parents working together. Because that gives children survival advantage, again, evolutionary thinkers explain that in terms of the survival benefit of the children in two-parent households or in two-parent families. Now, you see, evolutionary thinkers can explain why fathers leave the family. They can also explain why fathers hang around and take care of the family, support the family. This kind of flexibility can raise criticism against evolutionary psychology. And the objection is usually referred to as just so stories. So just so stories is a label given to evolutionary theory that basically comes after the fact and can explain everything. So we read in the book, one of the shortcomings of evolutionary psychology is that its interpretations tend to be after the fact, looking back at what has happened and retelling the story of events through the particular conceptual lens of evolutionary psychology. Okay, so this is one. So essentially, there's not enough obstacles. There's not enough opportunity to falsify ideas in evolutionary psychology because we are trying to explain things that exist, phenomena that are present in terms of a history that is fairly inaccessible. I mean, we have indirect evidence of our history, but fairly inaccessible. So there's lots of speculation. Another critique, another shortcoming of evolutionary psychology is its tendency, has to do with its tendency to neglect culture, to neglect what is outside of the human body, specifically a reservoir of cultural material, language, rituals, practices. And when cultural resources are neglected, too much credit is given to genes and biological determinants of behavior. Okay, so of course there's a possible response that evolutionary thinkers can give here. We read in the book, in response to critics who contend that evolutionary psychology does not give enough importance to cultural factors, evolutionary psychologists put forward the counterclaim that culture itself is a result of evolution. That is true, but there is a distinction between biological evolution and cultural evolution, because cultural material can survive the death of individual members of a human society. And each one of us confront a vast reservoir of cultural material. We learn about some of it. We gain mastery over a very, very tiny portion of it, and we might contribute to it to some extent. But the cultural realm, the cultural domain, exists outside of us. We participate in it, but the cultural domain survives after I die, after you die, as individual members of the community. All right, so these are, you can think of what I said so far as preambles. Now you're getting into more abstract discussion of evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology gained influence during the 1990s, building on classical Darwinism, sociobiology, ethology, and related traditions. So you think about, for example, books like Steven Pinker's book, How the Mind Works. That was, I believe, published in the 1990s. So books like that, contributions like that in evolutionary psychology were around that time. The root, the main source of evolutionary psychology, the main source of inspiration is Charles Darwin's landmark book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. We read in the book that the basic tenets of the theory were independently put forward by Darwin and another Englishman, Alfred Wallace. Alfred Wallace proposed the theory a year earlier. And the credits is usually given to Darwin because he amassed substantial evidence and made the theory more convincing. Now, in this book, in our book, we read about very important influences on Charles Darwin himself. And these influences are important because there are certain contingent features of evolutionary theory that go beyond the evidence at hand and were shaped by these influences on Darwin's thinking. So we have two of them. I've included two of these influences, which I think are quite important. Two thinkers, one popular writer at the time, I think both were popular, kind of talking about economics and society and general topics. So Harriet Martineau was a popular writer who argued that government should not support poor people. Government charities, government-sponsored charities are not justifiable, Martineau argued, because you are basically supporting a kind of a group of people who are not fit to survive on their own. So if you support them, you give them the ability to procreate, to have more babies who cannot survive, who are not good at the business of living. So this doesn't help. It's essentially a waste of resources. You see in Harriet Martineau's argument, a prejudice based on the distinction among classes. So Martineau believed that lower classes are different, maybe biologically different from higher classes. There's something essentially different between these classes. Somebody who belongs to a higher class is there, it has that belonging because they are biologically more adept, more fit to survive, to deal with life. Thomas Malthus, who is associated with the term Malthusian cycles, the going back and forth between abundance and shortage. Thomas Malthus talks about rapid growth of population when there is enough resources, and then you go through a period in which the resources are very limited and not everybody can survive. So Malthusian cycles are cycles of population increase and then famine. And the general idea is that over time, there are more births than survivals. You might also point out that Thomas Malthus was referring he was not referring to universal human societies. He was referring to a particular kind of society, a subset of possible human societies that go through those cycles. Okay, so Charles Darwin's ideas were tacitly influenced by the way in which he discussed evolution, especially in relation to human beings. So Darwin's theory frames thinking about life in a particular way. So one of those ways is that Darwin's theory depicts a situation in which the winners in evolution are those organisms which survive to reproduce a greater number of offsprings so that their characteristics spread and eventually alter the characteristics of the entire population. So one characteristic becomes dominant. That characteristics, we could say, wins over the species. These extensions become especially problematic when they lead to thinking about racial characteristics, racial inferiority, superiority. I mean, the idea of race in biology, that itself is very highly questionable. If we have a construct of race that has a place in culture, has a place in history, it is a construct that doesn't map neatly to biology and biological thinking, and it also, for that reason, should be handled very carefully in evolutionary psychology. Anyways, another limitation of these problematic extensions is that it forgets that evolutionary processes are about not only about genes, but about gene environment fit. So genes exert their influence indirectly through highly complex interactions. And the environment plays a fundamentally important role in the timing and nature of gene expression. So we can think about genetic predispositions that never become activated because the environmental conditions are not satisfied. Or you can think about conflicting behavioral tendencies, conflicting emotional tendencies, conflicting life strategies, life history strategies that become active in different times or in different environments. Again, because what matters is the interaction between genes and the environment. Okay, I want to end with one note about possible complementary perspectives. There's this one paper that I like. It's just one example of people trying to see the shortcomings of evolutionary thinking, especially when we think about human societies, human sociobiology in this case, and how that approach has blind spots, and how that kind of thinking could be complemented with fundamentally different ways of thinking. So, for example, in this article that was published a long time ago in 1987, it was written by Zhang Boshu. At the time, he was working at Chinese Academy of Social Science in Beijing, Department of Philosophy. This paper was published, I said already, in 1987. It was published in the journal Biology and Philosophy. So in it, the author focuses on not only evolutionary theory, human sociobiology, but also Marxist theory. Why? Because there are elements in Marxist theory, theoretical elements in Marxism, that are completely neglected. For example, modes of production. That completely gets us out of that style of thinking that emphasizes continuity, that history of how a behavior gave survival benefits to members of a species. When you think about modes of production, forms of practice, the material conditions of a human life, then you can more easily pay attention to discontinuities, leaps, qualitative shifts that happen as one mode of production, one mode of material production is replaced with another mode of production. When one set of practices, material conditions of a practice, or in general, material conditions of life are replaced with another set of conditions. Those are aspects of human life, human societies, human culture that might be visible in theories about cultural evolution, but they are not, generally speaking, emphasized and attended to in evolutionary psychology. So if you're interested in a balanced perspective, how a kind of balanced perspective can be pursued, I would encourage checking out this 1987 paper by Zhang Boshu. All right, let's pause here, and next time we will turn to the last topic in our series, namely social constructionism. Thanks very much for your attention, and until then.